are on the True Stories Lab. Welcome. I know that as a child you were into theater. I mean, you came by it naturally because of your family, which I hope we'll get a little taste of in your story.
Yeah.
And but then you did end, like many of us, you kind of went into the corporate world. But then way back in 2007, yonder year of 2007, which is actually the same year that I left the corporate world, you left the corporate world, and I'm
We
so
escaped
glad.
together
Yeah, that's right.
in
Although,
different places.
yeah, I was in Qatar and you were in Tampa, I presume, because you're born and raised in Tampa. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
your story, your subject matter is always about Florida, at least in the stories that I've heard so far, and they're amazing. And I'm looking forward to the story you're about to tell right now, which is mismatched. So without anything further from me, I'm going to just go ahead and introduce your story.
It's Halloween morning, and my best friend, Mark, and I were walking to our sixth grade center late. And we grew up in sort of the standard middle class section of my neighborhood. But as we're walking closer to school, we're getting to the area where the houses have seen better days. So he and I are, going through what's basically an empty neighborhood at that point because, it's late. A lot of people are off at work. We're walking down the middle of the street, and as we get to this intersection, we hear this really insistent mewing, like this crying of a kitten somewhere, and we look around and we don't see anything. Just like nothing. So we realize that what we're hearing is coming from the storm drain just off in front of us. So we rush over and we try and look down the drain, and we can't see down. So we see that there's this big iron manhole cover there, and we manage as, sixth graders to like lift this thing up and shift it over, and we lay down on our stomachs and we look down, and what we see is what would have been a perfectly white kitten, but he's filthy and he's got his paws up on the manhole wall. He wants out, and we have a problem because as these two kids have gone through growth spurts, and I'm this fat buck-toothed kid with braces, and Mark is probably 3 inches taller than me and wiry and real cut for a sixth grader, and good looking with his glasses. And so we're trying to figure out what to do. How do we get this kitten out? And as luck would have it, we're in the kind of neighborhood and the part of the neighborhood where a baby comes walking, toddling down its driveway and into the gutter along the street towards us. And of course, that baby is dragging a broom with him. And so, now don't worry about this baby. I know this is a story about rescuing a cat, but we get the broom from the baby, and which answers the question, is it as easy to take a broom from a baby as candy? Yes, it is. So we put the broom down, and the little kitten uses its little needle-like claws and latches on to the broom, and so we pull it out. And when it gets out, we can see that this dirty little white kitten that's probably, the size of a softball has the craziest eyes. One blue eye, one brown eye. And, in a lot of ways, I kind of, in retrospect, think back, like those weird eyes were like the weird pair that Mark and I were. We were best friends, like brothers, from the time that we were little kids. And we fought like brothers. I mean, we would beat the shit out of each other. The interesting thing about Mark, though, who is much bigger than me and much stronger than me, is that Mark was a chivalrous fighter. He would only use his fists. I, however, was a enraged street fighter, and I would gouge your eyes out if I had to win, or to get out from underneath you while you're battering the crap out of me with your fists. So, but that's how we didn't have language to discuss things. As brothers, we would just fight. So we had a problem. Who was going to keep this cat? I lived at this house and Mark lived next door. Only one of us could keep the cat. And of course I felt entitled to keep this cat because, Mark had dogs, and my cat that I'd had since I was a little kid had just died the summer before, just months earlier. And the cat was now latched on to me. And this is the time at which we would have faced off and said, it's mine. No, that's mine, and fought. But Mark didn't fight me that day. And I don't know. At the time, I didn't know why. But what I think about now is that maybe he needed, more than that cat, he needed a friend. And he was willing to give up that fight, because what I found out later was, and just days later, is that Mark's dad, who he idolized, was leaving the family. And, you know, within days after getting that kitten home, Mark's dad was gone. You know, and I always felt like Mark had been, you know, kind of my refuge, because I grew up in a crazy family. My dad was a theater professor. My mom had wanted to be a nun, and she married him anyway. You know, and I grew up, just briefly, I grew up in this house where my dad was a hoarder, and he was this crazy creative, self-loathing college professor who would go into these rages and just go after you, and you just didn't know if it was going to stop. You just didn't know if it was going to stop. So I'd go to Mark's house, and we would draw superheroes. And there was no tension or fighting in that house. It was just us sitting at a dining room table, drawing. And, you know, and the funny thing is, I knew how to draw. I knew anatomy because my dad had me, like, I bought my first car sculpting puppets and props when my dad was a contractor for Epcot. So I knew anatomy, and I knew spacing and that sort of thing. But I would copy Mark's superheroes, which he drew so poorly, because I wanted to fit in with him. I wanted to be like him, and I wanted that safety. So I would draw weird muscles that didn't make sense in these superheroes. So there we were. Me, this fat bucktooth kid with braces, Mark, who for some reason doesn't fight me on this kitten. And I take it home, and he goes to his house, and I don't know how it happened, but I heard in the neighborhood, or maybe it was Mark's sister, I'm not sure exactly, but I learned that Mark's dad was gone, and he wasn't coming back. And Mark folded in on himself and stopped talking. And, you know, he didn't have the language. He didn't have the energy to fight me, and maybe he wanted to give me that gift of that kitten, or maybe he just didn't have the energy, but whatever it was, we didn't fight. You know, and I've gone through a lot of therapy over my life, over my weird childhood, and all kinds of crazy stuff that's, you know, happened. But I don't regret most of the insanity that also made my life interesting growing up in my household. You know, and I'm not even sure that I would go back and give Mark that kitten. But what I do regret is that we did not fight that day. And that was the day that we were kind of friends a little bit after that. But because he gave that kitten but didn't have the energy to explain to me how he felt, we didn't fight. And I wish we had fought, and I wish we had stayed brothers.
Thank you, Will.
Sure. Now I'm going to go find a Kleenex now. And
I know. Me too. It's very sad how, but I mean, you know, I think what's interesting, there's a lot interesting about this story. We'll unpack it in a second, but is that can happen as adults as well. And,
yeah.
And the language of fighting has to evolve, right? It can't stay
right.
each other
Yes.
up.
Yes, we do not want to pummel each other in adult life, right? But as little kids, it has its place for a while.
Right. But I mean, you know, as adults, and you can lose friendships essentially over the same thing.
Right.
When you don't address conflict in relationships, and it's a tragedy. I do have a question though.
Sure.
You kind of answered it there at the end, but like, was that you said, because you said you wouldn't give the cat back. Did the cat give you refuge? Like, did you find in that sweet little kitty a little companion in your house that was all yours to sort of?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I had a.
And what was the cat's name? What did you name it?
So in honor of Halloween, we named him Spook. And so, so I had this little, ghost-like white cat with crazy eyes. And yeah, for a number of years, he was a little companion. And, and there's a whole other story about how he died and all that sort of thing and how wrenching that was for me and my sister. But yes, it was really a gift that Mark gave me. Whether it was intentional or not on his part, I'll never truly know. But I know that he was chivalrous enough to only fight with his fists. So maybe he was a more advanced human being than I was at that point. I'll never know.
But didn't you say your family still has a home in that neighborhood, or am I?
Oh yeah, my parents still live in that same house that I grew up in. Yep.
I take it Mark does not. His family is not still in that same.
His mom actually still lives there, but my dad is such a challenging human being that area, Mark's mother, will not talk to him. so I don't have any real contact. So it's one of the things where I respect the fact that my crazy family violated the bounds of good neighbors, and so I don't venture over there and knock on her door and see what's up with Mark. And and the reality was that Mark and I were like brothers, and then we drifted apart, and I've completely lost track of him, and he's completely lost track of me. And I don't do Facebook, so I guess I could find him, but I haven't.
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of people don't do Facebook, and people do get lost. We moved all the time when I was growing up, so I remember so many stories with this person, that person, the other person, and yet I've had zero contact with them since. But yeah, it's tragic when that I think it's interesting because you mentioned, that you've been in therapy and so on and so forth. Do you feel like your conflict resolution has gotten better?
Well, I think therapy is a great thing. It's an interesting, fun adventure. In addition, huh? Yeah, well, now, sometimes when you end up bawling in the middle of a session, which apparently I have the capacity to do, because I could argue the story, but yeah, it is painful and interesting, but also grounding, I think, to look through some of the things that you just sort of assume are, this is just the way things are. And for me, therapy gives you the perspective to say, that's the way I see it, and that's the way I always saw it. But there's a lot of different ways to unpack this. And there are people that are healthier and further down their road than I am that can look at the same information and have a healthier perspective on it. And so I look at where other people are, and I look at where I was and how things have changed for me over time. So yeah, I'm a total fan of therapy because of the different perspective and vantage point that it gives you to look at your own life and then make different decisions rather than act reflexively.
True. Very true. And I think that's obvious it's one thing to get emotional while you're telling a story, but at no point did I feel like, oh no, things are bad. I'm worried about Will right now. I was more invested in the story. And I think that is a big deal in terms of telling stories that go deeper, that reveal these emotional truths. It's not good to be going through them. You know what they say, tragedy plus time.
Right. Equals comedy.
Tragedy on its own can just be terrible to watch.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that's how I look at that time. That time, if you have some different perspective, allows you to say, yeah, crazy, weird things happen, but I don't have to relive those continuously. I can take from that a lesson or an interesting anecdote, but I can also use that as a foundation to make different decisions rather than just, as I said earlier, act reflexively and do the same things that may not advance me or my relationships.
Right. And when we start to see the stories in things, it feels less like, at least my experience has been, it feels less like things are happening to me rather than I am an actor in what's happening. And when I say actor, I don't mean like going through the motions. I mean in the active sense of a person acting in a capacity of, right? Like
right,
the hero or the Joker or whatever my place is. Like,
Yeah, well, I've noticed that in your stories, though, is that you always have agency in your story, and you're not afraid to be super vulnerable.
nah,
And you also, you know, and you're not, yeah, you're not afraid to make yourself look good and bad, and you know, and but that's the thing that, you know, when I try and create stories, I try and this is what I've been learning and working with you is, you know, having that agency within the story where things are happening, things are coming at you, but what do you do now to interpret and reinterpret that and not just have it be this tragic thing that happened, but it's something that I can do something with. And maybe if I share it and if I really open up, maybe somebody will relate to it and say, maybe there's an opportunity in my own life in that thing that I'm afraid to tell anyone that that person just said out loud, God forbid.
100%. We don't, you know, I think it's much easier. The reason that I think we as a human race have learned from stories is because it's much easier to point at someone else and say, well, boy, I'd never make that mistake. And then when it happens to you, you're like, I'm not going to make that mistake. Right. Whereas when we look at our own lives, it can be a lot trickier to see the mistakes that we're making. It's just easier to regard somebody else's story and learn from it than to be told what to do or think. It's sort of like it's easier to edit somebody else's essay than to write one.
Oh yeah, I mean, I know exactly how other people should live their lives.
Yes. Woo.
Woo.
So, what's next for you? I know you said you were doing some rehearsing with people from Spitfire. What's next for you in terms of performing?
Well, you know,
any sort of artistic endeavor? Do you still draw? I don't know this. Do you?
Actually, you know, I doodle. I mean, I used to be a pretty good artist and a very good sculptor. Now, I guess my creative outlets are more doing woodworking. And I buy houses that are messed up and restore them. And I try and do quirky, interesting little things that I love that are fun that make the projects take way too long to finish just because I get wrapped up in little details. But so anyway, I guess, you know, that's a creative outlet. And
Rehab Addict on HGTV. Nicole, the Rehab Addict. Have you ever seen that show?
Yeah, you know, that's the funny thing is I don't ever watch. I've never seen an entire restoration show, and yet I've restored scores of houses.
Got it. All right. Totally
But
cool.
yeah, so you know, I'm doing some improv stuff at Spitfire in the limited capacity that we can do that, and I'm looking forward to maybe doing more plays in the future. I've done a couple plays as an adult over the last few years, and so you know that, and I'm just dealing with the fact that I've got two adult 18-year-olds that are going off to college, and I've got one 16-year-old, and so I'm on the verge of empty nesthood. So I'm trying to spend as much time.
How does that work? If you're are you shared custody with the 16-year-old? So
Yeah,
how does the homeschooling part work? I'm curious.
How does the homeschooling part work?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, my ex-wife and I have 50-50 custody.
Right.
And so they go back and forth between two different houses that we set up so they're in the same neighborhood. And so the kids have, you know, always.
I guess at 15, you're not directing the lessons as much. You're not part of the homeschooling as much as it would be for younger kids.
My kids are so intelligent. I couldn't homeschool them if I tried. They are so far advanced of where I was when I was in high school that, like, seriously, they do not need my help. They're
right.
very
and they're self-disciplined, I take it too.
Yeah, they're and their mom is a little better at structuring things than I am. I have to admit, she and I have a good parenting relationship, and so fortunately for the kids, they get. You know, we do a little role reversal. I'm the warm and fuzzy parent. She's the structured, you know, hard ass parent. So you know.
I think that's pretty true in a lot of houses, actually.
Yeah.
But
she.
I gotta show you though, my dog, while listening to your story about the kitten, was totally having like little nightmares. I muted myself because he was like, Here's you can't tell from that image, but he was like he kept hearing kitten, kitten. I mean, he is afraid of cats. It's true.
Yeah, well,
open.
Had you not muted yourself, I would have just taken that as audience feedback. So thanks. What's your dog's name?
Hartley.
Thanks for the intention, Hartley. I appreciate that.
He's like, why are they talking? I'm trying to get my 23 hours of sleep. Oh dear. Oh, the COVID troubles. So anyway, but I mean, now is a great time to be crafting stories, right? Because what else are we going to entertain ourselves with? You can only watch so much television, right?
Right.
Better to make entertainment than be entertained. So thank you, Will.
Yes, well, thank you for providing the venue for doing this, and and also the rigor, because I've always been that guy that had a couple of beers in the kitchen with my friends and told stories, and they've always been really polite and listened all the way to the end and laughed, probably because sometimes I was funny and sometimes they were drunk or both. But I appreciate the rigor.
You feel the difference when you start with a crisp first sentence, and I have to say, you'll hear it. Your last sentence, because I know what it was. I got a little muddy, and it just makes such a huge difference when you land, when you take off and land with intention.
Yes, well, and as you know, this story is still a work in progress and needs lots of work, and but or at least it needs some work. So I appreciate the structure that you're and the venue. So thanks.
I have to say, I saw somebody making fun on social media somewhere, Instagram, Facebook, of like waving goodbye on a Zoom, and they're like, I have literally never left a meeting waving goodbye. And I just did that. I just was like, thanks, Will, bye.
Right, or of course, if you ever pay attention to this in movies, you notice that no one ever says goodbye in a TV show or movie. If they're on the phone,
never. That drives me crazy. It's like say hello to either.
Right.
But, that's the power of starting and ending in the action.
That's right. Yes.
Time for those words like hello and goodbye.
So
done.